David Wilcock is a professional intuitive consultant who, since reading Richard C. Hoagland's The Monument of Mars in 1993, has intensively researched ufology, ancient civilizations, consciousness science, and new paradigms of matter and energy. He's the author of a critically acclaimed trilogy of scientific research works known as the Convergence series, which gives definitive support to the idea that a change in matter, energy, and consciousness is now occurring on the Earth and throughout the solar system. He's the co-author of the book, The Reincarnation of Edgar Cayce. By the way, an uncanny resemblance to Edgar Cayce, to the point where so many people actually believe that David Wilcock is indeed the reincarnated Edgar Cayce. Summary of his latest scientific work appears therein, with a breakthrough case for mass spontaneous DNA evolution on Earth is unveiled. David Wilcock, our guest tonight on Coast to Coast AM. David, welcome back. How are you?
I'm very honored to be here, George. It's nice to hear your voice.
Last time we talked was a month or so ago with Winfrey on, of course, the reincarnation of Edgar Cayce. Maybe a little bit later on tonight we'll chat a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, we got the transcript of that whole show up on my website, ascension2000.com, if anybody wants to see it.
Excellent, indeed. Tell me a little bit about the work you've done into interplanetary climate change. How did you get involved with that?
Well, originally I was hired on to this seminar tour called The Time of Global Shift. And that was from Dr. Scott Mandelker. He hired me as his research director. And we already knew about the fact that the sun was showing signs of change and so forth. Mandelker was in touch with a man who is very, very prominent in alternative physics, but not known to the general public. And this guy has been harassed numerous times. In fact, I mentioned him once before because he was the guy who got a free energy device working, and then the next day goes to his son's baseball game and is gone for 5 hours and comes back, and all the things in his apartment are gone. The shower curtain rod, the carpets, the furniture, everything, including, of course, the machine. So this guy is not exactly public, so I'm not going to say who he is on the air. But anyway, he sent Scott this email, Dr. Mandelker, and said, you got to get David to look at this article. So when I went to the article, it was called Planetophysical State of the Earth and Life, which was translated from Russian, originally written by a guy named Dr. Oleksii Dmitriev.
Okay.
And Dmitriev was the first one to come out with this idea that the changes that we see on the Earth cannot be simply the result of human interference, at least in the conventional sense of pollution, because what we see on the Earth is apparently a field effect that's occurring throughout the entire solar system. And we have very tangible evidence that Dmitriev brought up all the way back in 1997. So at first what I did is just to follow along and basically try to raise awareness of Dmitriev's work because nobody knew about it. But then as time went on, I realized that he had only opened the door and it was very underdeveloped. So over the years since I first heard about this, which was at the tail end of the year 2000, I have intensively researched this subject, and especially when I got a call from Richard Hoagland earlier this year, around early March, and he finally was willing to say, well, you know, even if I don't totally know about the Edgar Cayce story, and it's not our focus anyway, well, I really need you to, you know, we got to bring this interplanetary climate change model out to the public. So when he told me that he'd want to co-author an article with me, which looks like it's going to turn into a book, we haven't titled it yet, but we've already discussed that, and it is going to happen. So that book, that concept, the idea of creating something with him was a tremendous inspiration to me, and I went totally bonkers doing research. And I've uncovered, in the course of that research, incredible information. And what makes it so poignant, George, is that it's not alternative science. One of the rules that we tried to do is say, if the Russians came up with it and that's the only source we've got, it gets thrown in the garbage can because we can't determine where they got it, because all these references are to Russian-written journals, and we don't have access to those journals. We don't know where they are. We can't read them. We can't translate them, etc. If any of this stuff is real, if this is as big and as massive and as all-encompassing as we believe it to be, then there's got to be stuff that NASA has been saying about it right in plain sight, right out there on the Internet for everybody to look at. So one of the rules was it had to be mainstream science. One of the rules was it had to be either the European Space Agency or NASA. And one of the rules was that it had to be something that you could link to on the Internet that had the full write-up so that you could actually read it for free online.
You know, David, I have always believed that the things that have been happening on this planet, the ice ages, the polar shifts, everything that has occurred might be one cyclical but can't be directly related to things that man is doing on this planet. And I think you are absolutely on top of something which should prove, I would hope, once and for all, that you can't merely blame greenhouse gases for the ills of this planet.
Oh, God, no. It certainly is not helping. I mean, let's be honest.
Well, it may speed things up a little bit.
But it's not the cause. It's not even remotely the cause, and I think if we were piloting free energy devices and not emitting any pollution whatsoever, that doesn't necessarily solve the problem.
Right.
Because the problem is happening through the whole solar system. And then you got to decide, do you want to even use the semantic term problem, or is it more that we are being led through a collective spiritual initiation in which we have to face our deepest fear about the idea of planetary and personal annihilation? And maybe that's not what it's about at all. In fact, one of the things that I wanted to bring out with your listeners tonight is that in Wiltshire, England, on Silbury Hill, there was a crop circle that showed up just last week. In fact, it was first reported on July 21st, but I only heard about it a couple days ago. And this crop circle, we've seen crop formations for thousands of years. There's reports of formations showing up like in the 1400s and so forth. And ever since the 70s, in the beginning, it was just little round circles, and that's all you saw. And then into the 80s, it got to be like two circles that had a bar between them. Then into the late 80s, things started to heat up. Then 1991 came along, and at Barbary Castle in England, there was this one incredible formation that Richard jumped on and put into his book, Monuments of Mars.
Very sophisticated.
Showing this thing that looks like a tetrahedron.
Right.
Like a three-sided, this pyramid inside a sphere. And then when Richard did the analysis on it, you find out that all the angles perfectly match with this geometry of the tetrahedron inside the sphere. Now, that was back in 1991. The crops are, you can't even call them circles anymore. The crop formations have increased in complexity ever since that time. And this physics model that we're drawing off of in order to explain why this interplanetary climate change matters is a physics that gets into a non-electromagnetic energy source. It's a source that is underneath electromagnetic energy. And I want to point out something important. That is that, as you remember, George, the last time we were on, a very unfortunate thing had happened because the night that Richard and I were on with Art Bell, Eugene Malov had passed away.
Right, was murdered, actually.
It was a murder.
Yeah.
It was a bludgeoning murder. And I don't know if you're aware of this either, especially after, if your audience has been seeing the Manchurian Candidate movie. Did you know that the guy that murdered Eugene Malov ended up being murdered?
The guy that they suspect murdered Eugene Malov.
Yeah.
Yes, I had that on a couple weeks ago.
That's a little weird.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't been listening to the show every night, so I wasn't sure if you'd got that or not.
Well, and that was a high school basketball player who is obviously not in high school anymore,
right.
But he was shot in a robbery attempt at a Dairy Queen or type store.
That's correct.
By the owner. And, I got to tell you, though, David, and this is, of course, not a Eugene Malov show right now, but I have my suspicions about that because I happen to think that something more substantial happened to Eugene Malov.
It's weird. It is weird. It's weird that something happened to him, and then it's weird that the perp ended up getting killed as well.
Yep.
In such a short period of time. And we did the show that had he not died, we might have had him on as a guest.
That's
talking about free energy. Now, for those who don't know, and Richard made sure that I dotted my I's and crossed my T's on this before we went on the air, Eugene Malov was the head writer for all the science coming out of MIT, which is arguably one of the most prestigious universities in the world. He was the big guy. He was the guy. And what happened was he found out that these